What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to LUMIX Live. It has been a couple of weeks since we were actually live. Obviously, I was away for the last 2 weeks doing some traveling for work. We were at TwitchCon, and then we were at a massive training event down here in, well, actually close to here, over in Houston. And yeah, we're just really excited to be back. This week, we're going to kind of ease back into the live streams. So we are going to be talking actually about something that came up in the big training session that Matt Fraser and I were doing last week, which is actually talking about live view composite. And yes, we've talked about this a number of times in previous streams, but what kind of really kind of got me back on the point of like, this is something I think we really need to talk about and kind of expand a bit more on it, is a lot of times when, we mention or we think about, features like live composite or modes that are computational in nature, we think that these are, fairly specialized capabilities, but in this case, it's commonly talked about for like star trail photography or this concept of light painting and stuff like that. And most of the time, those are topics in photography that, and technically even in videography as well, that usually you assume that you have to have a relative level of experience to create things like this. I think for a lot of people, unless you've done, star trail photography or you've done light painting or tried to do portraits in this kind of method, they may just seem a bit daunting because there's a lot of trial and error in the traditional ways that these are captured. And that keeps a lot of people from maybe trying to experience this kind, or at least try to capture these images. And as I said, this kind of hit home because for the last week, we were actually training a number of people who are varying levels of experience. We have some people that are kind of well-versed on the video side. They know a good amount on how to, expose, capture video, things like that. And then in the photography side, you have a decent number of people that have that same level. But for the vast majority, these were new users, people that are new to working with interchangeable lens cameras. So yeah, I wanted to take the time today because I've got a ton of new examples of how this works. I want to walk through a little bit of like, okay, so how did we capture these? How were these, kind of directed? And then also kind of hopefully impart some of the benefits of what this can bring for your creative output, whether it's for a client, whether it's for just something that you enjoy doing. Because while Live View Composite is a photographic-based feature, there is a pretty cool, interesting way that you could integrate this into your video production instead of having to necessarily set up and do this from a stills perspective, right? We talk about things like variable frame rate on the S1H or on the GH series cameras, right? Where you have a kind of hyperlapse mode in there because you can undercrank the sensor and do, 1 or 2 frames per second out in your project timeline. But having something that just be able, that just allows you to be able to click start on it and then create this singular image in the end can speed up that workflow in video as well. So we're going to talk about how that kind of works. But as mentioned, we are back. This will be a open with AMA, so you'll also have the opportunity to be asking us some questions. I already see a number of people are doing that down in the chat. So if you have questions, make sure to tag at LUMIX USA. It helps me see them so that we can go through and I can answer as many of them as I can. And just putting this out there, we don't comment on future firmware plans or potential updates. We don't speculate or comment on rumor sites. We don't speculate or comment on future products. So if your questions are around those particular topics, unfortunately, I don't have any answers I can give you, and I won't be bringing those questions up. So before we dive into that, let's quickly talk about LUMIX Pro Service. Here in the United States, we have Red and Platinum. Red is the free tier. If you've purchased a LUMIX camera, make sure to get yourself registered on that. You can use the QR code that's right below me right now. And you can get yourself registered on there. You get your 3-year extended warranty on your product that you purchased, as well as you get into the service and support program if you happen to have any kind of problems or issues that you need to send a camera in or lens in for. If you're someone who likes to have much better peace of mind with your equipment, or you're a working professional, where you really require this higher level of service, this is where you can take a look at the Platinum tier. That is a paid level service, but that gets you the 3-year extended warranty, 20% off out of warranty repairs of a drop, break, bang up a camera, lens, things like that. You get a break on the repair costs of that. You also get 2-day repairs with next day shipping both ways. So you're without your gear for a much shorter period of time. You also have access to the membership hotline. So if you're someone who prefers to speak to a person over the phone for service and support, you have access to that as well. So yeah, if it's something you're interested, take a look at LUMIX Pro Services. It's a pretty slick program, and we have it available. If you're not in the United States, we do have a link down in the description below that will bring you to the global portal so you can see if it's available in your region and what tiers are available for you as well. Cool. So before we go into the camera, I've got the camera set up because I want to walk through quickly how to get to it. We are using the S5 Mark II here to go through this. I want to just address some of the questions that are in the chat before we dive into that. So Genie Lamp says, hi, what is the best GH7 settings for timecode? I record mainly interviews, lectures, and social media videos. When should I select drop frame or non-drop frame in the GH7 settings? This is a pretty good question. This is actually something I had to look up a bit too, because I don't utilize timecode all that often, honestly. I think I've used it maybe once in a potential multicam kind of thing. But in general, the kind of base concept that I've always understood is that drop frame for timecode is going to be fine for what you're basically describing, right? You want timecode to actually stick to the frame rate that you're recording, because if you're doing 30 frames per second, you're not actually recording at 30 frames per second, you're at 2997. So you want your timecode to account for that so that it stays true to basically the real time, right? It skips the extra frames that are needed to be a true 30 frames per second video clip. On the flip side of that, non-drop frame, which will be recording at a true, if you got it 24 or 30, I think 60, those are actually at those frame rates. So that's where you could potentially, if it's a long run at 30 frames per second, you could be getting some drift. And those are situations where you're probably going to use that when you're maybe doing more work integrating in with animation or stuff like that. So Jeannie, for you, I would recommend doing drop frame for it. It's, from everything I understand about timecode, it's probably the most common one to be using. And yeah, you have the choice on the GH7 to change these things, especially if you're using like a timecode generator or something along those lines to feed it into the camera. So you've got the choices, but for interviews, things like that, I would leave it at non-drop frame. No, I would leave it as drop frame as the default settings for it, and then you should be good. And you just have to make sure if you're using a timecode generator that everything's matched up and you're on the right frame rates and all that kind of fun stuff. Yeah, that'd be my recommendation. Let's see here. McCary, nice to see y'all here too. Fielding, good to be back. Let's see here. S says, I haven't found any information online about this. When wet cleaning my two S5 Mark IIs with swabs, haven't had to do it yet. How do I set the camera? Turn it off or on? Across the board, whenever you're going to be doing, if you choose to do sensor cleanings yourself, and if you choose to do a wet cleaning, don't have the cameras powered on. That's just asking for potential trouble. I don't care what brand it is. You are using a liquid solution that can be conductive, and if you happen to use too much of it, there's so many ifs involved with that you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're basically kind of screwed because maybe you put too much on and the solution leaks out over the side and then goes down into the sensor carriage. That could short things out. When the cameras are not powered and you have everything off and no battery in the camera, you're going to be more protected-ish that way. To be clear, any damage caused by sensor cleaning, if you're doing it yourself, is not considered a warranted item for repair. So if something were to happen, you're taking responsibility over that. Manufacturers don't cover that kind of service and support. That's one of the reasons why, like, you can send cameras in to be cleaned and serviced by the manufacturers. But if you are going to go about this, I think some basic common sense things are probably a good way to go. Make sure there's no power, no battery in the camera, no power there. Yes, the sensor floats when it's off, so that can make it more difficult than it used to be when you had hard-mounted sensors. But that's just kind of how that is. Yeah, so that's what I would say about that. If you're ever in doubt about getting a sensor cleaned, I always recommend doing it professionally, either sending it into the manufacturer or taking a shot with any of the number of kind of services that will do sensor cleanings for you. I know a lot of dealers will have people come in and do that for you, because if you do it that way, remember the liability is put onto the company that's doing the sensor cleaning typically. Just make sure that things are clear on that path. Marlene, welcome. Good to see you in the chat. Does the S9 have the S9 doesn't have Live View Composite, right? Could you tell us why that is, or are there plans to add it? So yeah, the S9 does not have Live View Composite. I'm not 100% sure the reason why it doesn't have it, and I don't know if it's something that was going to be added to that camera. Remember that camera has different sensor readout modes because it has no mechanical shutter, even though on like the S5 Mark II, Mark IIX, the cameras that do have Live View Composite, it is using the electronic shutter. There are some differences in the way that the images are captured there. So it is something that Matt Fraser and I have brought up to our engineering team to say, like, hey, is this something that could get added to the camera? Because it's a pretty killer feature. But yeah, at this point, I don't have any clear info on that one for you. I think that addressed McCary, your question too. Fielding says, suggestions for G9 Mark II firmware: allow an open gate mode in PASM modes. I shoot photos in 4:3 and jump into 16:9 when I hit the red record button is a bit jarring. I hear you about that. I think part of this, you have to kind of maybe take a look at how we've always done video recording. Video recording going from PASM is always designed as a just like kind of quick, oh, I just need to capture a video clip. Open gate and things like that are considered high level video recording functions. That's why you have to change the mode into it. But I can definitely hear your perspective, Fielding. The reality is the G9 Mark II is a stills first camera. You are probably not going to see video functionality like that carry into that camera. If you need stuff like that, you're more likely to see those kinds of changes happen on a GH line camera. It is just the reality of when you have different products. Some products, they're designed for certain purposes, and that's the lane they stay in. So, Cameron, when trying to apply the coupon code, website says invalid. Cameron, so I have elevated this into our team, and our team and the team over at SanDisk Western Digital are also looking into it to kind of get that cleared up. As soon as we get any updated info, we'll let you know. Last two questions before I jump in and we start actually going in about Live Composite here. I wish Lumix didn't drop features. I purchased a GH5 Mark II for all the stuff G9 to S5 II can't do, like pre-burst 6K photo video, multiple exposure, focus stacking, live crop, B-cam to the G9 II. Yeah, so sometimes feature drop has to happen, especially when you're looking at GH5 Mark II or any of the GH5 series platform compared to the new series, because the new series cameras are running on a totally new engine. Sometimes it just happens. Certain features aren't compatible with the others. When we actually review how products are used by end users, we find that, hey, you know, we're not getting anyone that says that they're using this or showing that they're using these modes in the camera. So can we remove that and make space for something else, right? But this is that kind of cool thing of where, you know, the more you guys give us feedback, the more you interact with us, the more you tell us what features you really love using, what features maybe you don't really care that much about. That helps us kind of guide for future development, right? Whether it be firmware or whether it be, you know, hardware in future cameras. That's how product grows, is that we listen to what y'all say. And in some cases we may find that, yeah, that means some features get removed that some really love, and unfortunately the major side of the market would prefer certain things over what other features are. It's always a balancing act that I think all manufacturers are struggling with. I 100% feel with you though on the multiple exposure thing. I loved multiple exposure in the S5. When we got the early S5 Mark IIs and it wasn't in there, I was pretty bummed out about that because that was a fun feature to use. But yeah, like we said, the more you guys interact with us here, the more you let us know what those features are, just like you did, Macari. It helps us feed that back because it shows to the engineering team and the planning teams that, hey, these are features that people loved. Yeah. So I would say there's always hope about features and stuff like that. It's just it's a matter of just finding that balance point. Yeah. So, yeah, let's talk about Live Composite now. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Live View Composite, while yes, a lot of times we look at this mode as, you know, aiding those much higher level concepts in photography, light painting, star trails, light trails, even things like capturing lightning, which I think is one of those areas that until last week, I mean, I've done it numerous times, but I've worked with these cameras for years, so I know what their abilities are. But for some of those other users that, or people new to Lumix, you may not realize that, one, capturing lightning is something that I think many people would love to be able to do if you've got a camera, because it's a fun thing to just be able to do. But then when you go to actually try it, it becomes one of the most frustrating things in the world, right? Because when you go to take a photo of lightning, you know, you gotta, one, know the exposure concepts of the fact that it's going to be a flash, so you're going to be looking, actually in other cameras, you're looking at a black screen because you don't even know what the camera's capturing. And you have to kind of hope on timing, right? Did I get my exposure right? Do I have my framing right? And it's a lot of trial and error. So it becomes very frustrating. And for a lot of people, that can mean like, hey, I don't really want to play around with this because I don't want to think too much about this. This is a little bit too hard. Maybe it's a little too far out of your level of experience. So Live Composite really becomes that tool that is starting to bridge that side of content, or I hate to say content creation, of photography and videography. Taking these concepts and making it something where even if you have very little experience on the photography side, if you know the basics, you can capture some spectacular images that would be otherwise near impossible to capture in any other camera system. And this is something that we're very proud of because, you know, obviously we have it in the Micro Four Thirds cameras, we have it in all the many of the G series cameras, and in the crop censored side, it's not that new of a concept. We can fully admit we're not the only ones that do it in the crop sensor. However, knowing that many of you really covet and love the full frame cameras, we are the only full frame camera that does this. Nobody else does this. So if you're looking for a feature that actually, one, is a one-up over everybody else, but also gives you meaningful benefits, the S5 series is the one that's got you because we've got it in this. So what we're talking about with this is that feature, again, called Live View Composite. So Live View Composite can be found in the camera options here. Under the main camera, actually I can do it this way. Under the Photos menu, then under the Others Photo 2, and then you'll see Live Composite. And if you've never done this before, if you're always curious about what a mode technically does in a camera, if you push the display button, it'll give you a brief little kind of description for many things, not all things. So Live Composite means I can come in here, I can use a shutter delay if I don't have a shutter cable release, or I'm not using the Bluetooth connection to the camera. So I can come in, and then all I have to do is click Start. Camera's going to tell me to set the shutter speed and ISO to the exposure that I want, so that I have a baseline to work with. So in this particular case, one of the cool things with, say, light painting, right, is that you want to control all the aspects of what is going to be in the frame. So if you're using something like, I have this Godox, which actually this is Matt Fraser's. I just forgot to return it to him. So I have this like Godox LED light that, you know, will go through the different colors and all that kind of stuff. And it's a wand that I can paint with for light. So I can take something like this and I can use this as my main tool for lighting a subject or drawing patterns or creating a specific look that I want. But you don't want to have too much ambient light, right? If there is ambient light, you want to kind of control that to how you want the image to look. And what I mean by that is, if we look at this image right here, and if I go by the exposure meter, which you see right in the bottom, it's next to the it says -3. That means that if I were to just take a single image here, it's a 1.6 of a second. You see how dark that image is, right? That's not great. That's not, you know, anything that would be good. But because we're going to be doing this live composite function, I have the ability to set that base exposure and say, hey, I really like that I'm not totally losing the wall right behind. I'm not blowing that light out. So I can set the exposure for the first one. That first image that it captures is doing your noise reduction layer. So that's taking a black frame within the exposure value that you have so that you don't have to run into that challenge of doing long exposure and then waiting for long exposure noise reduction to duplicate the exposure, right? But on the bottom right, you're going to see, like straight below me, you're going to see it says 1/1.6 seconds times X. Live Composite is going to be taking a sequence of images at the same exposure value, so the same light level value, and it's just going to be overlaying them over and over and over again for up to 3 hours in the camera. So now, when I press this shutter, the first thing we see is that, like, yeah, image isn't really getting all that much brighter unless, you know, like I move my hand through the frame in certain cases and reveal more light over there. But this is where I can take the light, right? I can take this particular light, and we're going to do something just kind of simple. I've got it at 5500 Kelvin. So now I can just literally take this light and I can start painting into the image, and you see how it starts to brighten up. Now you'll see that I'm at a 26 second exposure and I'm still, you know, underexposed by general terms, right? So I can go through, I can kind of add some accent lighting. Now if I wanted to come in and change this and say add some red up front, right? So I want to come in and I want to take this and I want to start, you know, kind of basking some of this in red light, bringing that kind of accent up. Maybe bring it over to the side, you know, get a little bit harsher of a look here. Build it in there. And then say I want to take this and I want to adjust this to blue. We're going to go to like the police colors, right? US police colors. So now I've got blue. Now I can come in and I can start painting blue, give it some of those accents here, and really give the image a look that I want to give it, so I'm not stuck with just the kind of flat lighting. I don't have to necessarily worry too much about, you know, what the general exposure is. I can take my time, you know, setting this image up. I can take my time lighting it and understanding. This changes when you want to use a subject, and we're going to talk about that in a second with some of the sample images that I have. But you get a really, really cool effect, even to where, like, okay, I want to make sure that I get this light in the reflection there. So now I can really push some harsh light into here. You know, maybe get a cool looking effect there. Maybe bring a little bit more onto this side. And there we go. And say, like, all right, I'm good with that exposure. That's a minute and let's stop it at a 2-minute exposure, right? So we can see that counter going. We're at 153, 154. This lets you just constantly look. And even now while I'm talking, I can think about this, right? I can be looking at the image and say, yeah, you know, okay, I think I'm good with this image. So I'll press the shutter button again, and that image is saved. So when I go back and I actually review this image, I actually have that raw file with all of the look and style that I wanted onto it. And it was one image. If I was doing this in the more traditional sense, so like we said, that was a 2-second exposure. So if I turn There's a 2-minute exposure. So if I turn live composite off and I bring this all the way down to bulb, right? And I sit here and I just press and hold, and we're gonna talk here for a little bit. So I'm at 125. We're going to let this run. I've got my hand still pressed on it. We're gonna let this run to 127, and then we're gonna look and see what that image looks like, because this is what helps that concept of I want to experiment with lighting, I want to experiment with image capture, and I may not have a ton of experience with it. I don't have either the time. Say I want to do a long exposure that I'll show in a second after we're done with this image. Actually, I can probably do it now because this is more than enough time to get the point across. So see, we're still recording. If I let this image out and we take a look at it, that was about a 39-second exposure. This should be completely blown out at 39 seconds, but you already see the inherent problem here. So I've just stopped that exposure. Now I've got to wait 30 seconds for this to kind of work, right? I'm waiting for that noise reduction frame to go through. Takes a bunch of time, and this relates to things like the lightning photography. That's the word I'm thinking of. Lightning photography, in the sense that if I stop that exposure because I'm trying to capture the lightning and I'm not 100% sure if I got that one particular bolt in the frame, I got to look at it and I'm like, I missed it. Now I got to wait for that to run. And, law of the world is that the second you stop the exposure is when the one that you really want is going to fire. So you have a ton of frustration at that point. With live composite, I don't even have to think about that. So we see the one image here at a 41-second exposure. And then if I go back, you see the one that was a 2-minute exposure, as you saw. Now, the base exposure is 1/1.6 seconds. But you see the massive difference in what you're able to do, because of the fact that this is just blending a ton of images in together to get you that one exposure. So that's the general concept, right? That's how simple that mode is. Where this really comes into play is when you actually see it in the real world, right? So this was one of the shots I did in San Diego of downtown. Now, if I wanted to do a long exposure, your same principles are going to fall in here. I want to do light trails of these cars moving through to downtown, but I don't want to end up running out where, all the trees are blown out, the roads are blown out, all that kind of stuff. The reality is, if I took this with regular bulb, the image is going to look probably something closer to that, because you're just constantly going to be flooding the image with more and more and more light. Where being able to do live composite means I can maintain the exposure on the sidewalk, I can maintain the exposure that happens with the street lights, with the cars as they run by, and like you saw in that demonstration before, it's building on the screen. So I'm actually watching this grow, and I'm able to say, like, hey, okay, I see this car comes through. I can see around me that there's another car going to come through. There's a truck, but maybe it's going to be out of alignment where I want that particular light streak to go, so I can stop the recording and not end up ruining the amount of time that I took. This exposure, this was another like 5-minute long exposure of a downtown street. And you're able to see, like, I'm not blowing out the buildings. I'm able to see really good detail through everything. Yes, with long exposures, trees and things like that move will start to look a little different. But I get all of that detail, and I'm not overblowing anything in the actual frame. So that's one cool concept here with it. Again, with framing, you get to play around with the look. And you can see here how much of that detail is saved as I'm clicking on my Streamlabs thing here instead of actually the image. I maintain all of the detail I want in the highlights in the buildings, but I get all those light trails running through, and I'm not having to even second guess it. Literally, I set this camera up, I went back, was doing some work on the computer, came back out, and then was like, okay, cool, this looks good, I'm done, ready to go. Now, for lightning, this is the part where, this is really the part that kicked it off for me to be like, okay, this is something we need to talk about more, because as mentioned, Matt and I were sitting in an environment where we had a ton of people, and we're talking like 100, of people using various different cameras, various different setups, various different styles. They're trying to do steel wool photography. So that's where you light steel wool on fire and you spin it and you get the sparks and all that kind of fun stuff. Really cool, fun thing to do as long as you do it safely. But we're in Houston and we had this awesome thunderstorm way out in the distance that while everyone is watching the steel wool, we see a couple people start looking up to the sky and you see lightning bolts. That immediately starts to change that perspective for some, saying like, okay, so, you know, I got a couple of shots of the steel wool, but now I want to do lightning because that's one of the harder things to capture. I mean, there are tools that people buy, you know, light triggers, sound triggers, all that kind of stuff to help do these things. And the S5 Mark II has functions in it, and so does the S5, so does the G100, that mean you don't have to buy those tools. It's inherently built into it. So being able to come in here and say, hey, I want to be able to take a look at an image and say, hey, you know, the sky's there. I just want to set it, make sure that I have my exposure base set so that I'm not overblowing these trees too much, and then just let it run. The beauty of this is, again, that point of being able to watch it grow on the back of the camera. I'm not having to guess, did I catch that bolt? Did I catch, you know, what's it doing to the clouds? I can look in and say, I did it again. I can look in and say like, okay, cool. That's a good bolt. I really like the way that came out. I'm long enough now that I'm actually getting the stars above the clouds here. And we're in a, you know, a decently well-lit parking lot as well. So I have a cool looking image and I'm like, all right, you know, that's kind of cool. Let's see what else I can get. So when I stop the exposure, I can immediately start another exposure and then I get a bolt that I actually really liked here. So we get another one, again, really nice exposed. Because it's lightning, it's going to flash into the sky, so you're not going to have to worry about, do I actually see anything up here at first? You let the lightning illuminate that. You just make sure and set the exposure so that you're not destroying or blowing out too much in the trees. You set it to the light level you want. And then waiting a little bit longer, we got probably my favorite one, which is this one. Again, this is like a 6-minute long exposure of just letting the camera run. Being able to capture multiple bolts of lightning, all the kind of layering that I get in the clouds. We even have a couple stars coming through here because of the direction that we're facing. This is that level of capability that unless you've really had a lot of experience in long exposure photography, this would be incredibly difficult to try to do. And more likely than not, it's going to be extremely frustrating to do if you've never done it. So being able to play with this stuff, I think, is a really fun side. So I challenge all of you. If you've got an S5 Mark II, if you got an S5 Mark IIX, even an S5, if you have a G9 Mark II, GH7, if you've got a, I said an original S5, even if you have a G100, I encourage you to try this. Play around with Live Composite because you have it in all of your cameras there. And in a second, I'll tie this into the video side as well, because like I mentioned, there's a really cool way to use this in the video side as well. But I want to take a look at some of the questions. I saw a whole bunch of them come in here real quick. Dark says, hi, when will S5 2X firmware be updated or released? You can tell the technical team to include gyro metadata stabilization. I can ask them about it. I don't know if we're going to do gyro metadata for the stabilization. It's a cool concept, but it's incredibly time consuming. Fielding, I had struggles with Live Composite for lightning. The clouds moving look off in the final photo. I've been using time-lapse, but saw some really great pre-burst lightning shots. Yeah, there's plenty of ways to kind of get those particular style images. And a lot of it will come into what your personal preference is for how you want that final image to look. Personally, in my take, because of the way the clouds were looking with these images, I actually really loved. Again, I do it again all the time. I loved the way the clouds were kind of going through. Yes, if we look through, can you see things that maybe don't look supernatural? Yeah, but it's why these, in a lot of cases, unless you're doing this for scientific stuff, these are going to be more artistic style photographs, if we're all honest. But even at this point, like I said, being around a 6-minute exposure, it still looked in my opinion, awesome for what we were trying to get across. Because otherwise, even if you're doing a long exposure, then you just get the blurred clouds in the background. Where this, you can get a little bit more of that definition. But again, it's why it's a tool. You get to use this how you want to use it, and if it's something that works for that style of photography for you. Where was the other? The old 6K photo, 4K photo, the wife says thanks. She got some great lightning photos using those. Yeah, and the high burst modes can be a pretty useful tool for that. I think one of the things that you end up seeing is that if you're trying to capture, say, multiple bolts, things like that, if you want to level up your, kind of photography like that, that's where using features like this can help with it. Let's see here. So FC or JC says new box cameras released. They're new. The newer box cameras that are under our Pro division, those are similar to the BS1H and the BGH1. However, they have functionality that's required for live broadcast and integration into some of like our control suites that the BGH1 and BS1H don't have. So NDI, you have that functionality for those control systems. They are separate products. Those are actually sold through primarily our broadcast division. Means that in a lot of the dealers where maybe you require those things, you can buy them through some of the dealer network that you're probably already buying Lumix products from. But yeah, those features are for those cameras. You won't see those in the BGH1 or BS1H side of it. Different requirements between those areas. Let's see here. FC suggestion: I would like to have a custom button assigned to stop video recording. Currently, the same button does both start and stop. I've missed a few shots because I hit the button twice by mistake. It would be interesting. I would have to bring that up to the engineering team. Stuff like that comes more down to the user experience side of the cameras. If there's enough of a reason to do something like that, on average, we usually don't have that kind of challenge, but I can bring it up, FC, of course. Let's see here. Gyroflow metadata is time consuming, but professional stabilization is the best option. This is where you have to look at it and say, for your application, it may be the best option. There are many others that it is not. And no, not all other brands have it. It's a cool concept. I do not disagree, but that kind of stuff, there's a lot that goes into how powerful it can be. Not arguing that it can be an incredibly useful tool. At this point, it's just not something that I believe is on our radar to really kind of put time and effort into, because to begin with, our stabilization is better than any of the other manufacturers. So we haven't needed it. Doesn't mean that it's out of the question, but we are just not seeing really that big of a call for it because we haven't needed it. But that's why we do these streams, because you get your voice heard and we can reference this back to the engineering team. Say, hey, we're getting people. Dark Generation here is asking for it, that kind of stuff. That's why I like these streams. So, going back into, the live composite thing here. So we also talked about things of doing, we also talked about, being able to maybe do portraits with this, right? And this is also the really cool thing with the live composite function, is that live composite is very easy to also use with an external flash. Yes, we are recording using electronic shutter. No, you're not going to trigger the flash from the camera. You're going to be a little more creative in that kind of sense. So during this event, there were some fire dancers that were being, kind of exposed for the flames, right? So I'm shooting an exposure so that the flames are not white in the end resulting shot, right? I don't want to have it basically just be, white streaks that run completely around and have really no definition to it. So as this performer's, kind of moving the flames around and everything like that, you have an off-camera flash that fires, where in this case they have a couple of them positioned around so that, at the count of 3, you can have everything set. You kind of watch how the flames are building in the frame, and then you can say, okay, pop the flash and fire it. Now that image gets locked in. Because it's live composite, the flame part of it is constantly building, and I can see where that person is kind of roughly in the frame. But because I'm only exposing for the fire, I'm not exposing for this person, the tree back here, things like that. The flash is what will bring that into the image. So I can get these cool, kind of concept photos, right? You can do shots where, you're playing with motion blur and you're playing with flash, but then you're also playing with natural movement, in this case, the flames. These are all the things that you have access to. Now, if you are just using full manual exposure on this for, in this case, this was probably like a 10-15 second exposure. If you're doing a 10 or 15 second exposure, you're constantly filling the sensor with light. So the flames will illuminate the performer more. The general lighting in the area is going to light the background more. So you get this kind of glow out of it to where it almost looks like it's, say, broad daylight. Where live composite allows you to be much more directed with the light that you want to use, because the background will never get brighter than necessarily what you have set for this, the flames here. All of the lighting can be done with the flash to fill in and solidify that person's, position in the frame. These are the kind of cool things that you have access to if you've got some of the LUMIX cameras, especially the newer ones. And I reiterate, our G100, our least expensive camera in the lineup, has live composite. So you can do everything that we're showing here and get those images. In fact, these lightning photos were shot on a GH7. These ones weren't even done on the S5 Mark II. So you're able to get these really, really cool images. And the other benefit, too, is when you're using something like live composite or high-resolution shot mode or using the handheld version of it, because you're layering images on and you're using a shorter exposure instead of the longer, you typically get better noise profile out of the images as well. So you have a lot of flexibility here. Now, the coolest part of live composite, I think, is when you get into more of those artistic styles of capture, right? We've all seen light painting. We've all seen the stuff, the images where you're with a flashlight and you write a word out and all that kind of stuff. And it's cool. It's a lot of fun. It takes some thought because you have to write backwards to make sure that it reads right. You also have to kind of think about your positioning, how far you got to go and everything like that. Live composite, because you're only working on a very specific base exposure, gives you the time to actually take a beat and plan and kind of work through how you want the image captured. You can then execute part of it and then say, well, I kind of want to add maybe a little more accent lighting here. I want to, there's a particular look or something I want to add over in this corner, right, with light painting. And that's exactly what you can do with this mode. So when I go back in and we look at this, so this is actually how I ended one of our training sessions. We have an entirely dark room, and we literally are walking around with LEDs like this. In fact, Matt Fraser's actually right there. Good old Matt Fraser's hanging out in the background there. This allowed us to have a totally dark room, have this projected out over HDMI to a projector that's behind me, and we're able to walk through and paint with these lights over top of everybody. So on the initial exposure, you don't see anything in this room. You see a little bit of light coming from the blinds over here. You see my laptop, and then you see the projector's light coming from the projector. Every other piece of light in this frame, other than the minor adjustments that I've made to it, are done through adding these lights and watching it build on the screen to say, hey, I missed that second row. Let me go back in with the light and kind of, paint a little bit more to bring their face out a bit. Maybe be able to go in through and say like, hey, I want to add some accents up here onto the sky, onto the roof. That gives you a really cool way to add this next level to an image. Now, where it got really cool is when we were outside. Being able to go in and take a new concept. Now this photo right here, this was captured on my camera, but this was a photo directed by someone who has never used this feature ever before. Has never used our camera before, to my understanding. Them being able to direct out and say, hey, I want to spell LUMIX with my arms in lights on this long exposure, meant that I was able to set the camera up. They were able to set their S5 II up, set the base exposures we walked through, because we wanted to make sure we had a little bit of good light, you know, here on the bridge. Not a lot, you just wanted a little bit. We didn't want to blow out all the lights in the buildings in the back, and we wanted to capture it while we were still at the tail end of blue hour. So we wanted to have the actual clouds in the sky not be totally blacked out. So this meant, okay, I can set my first exposure so that I'm not losing the sky. I'm keeping some of the detail here on the bridge, but the rest is all going to be getting painted in with an LED light. This exposure is a 20-minute long shot. It took us 20 minutes to go through, set this up, make sure we're positioned right, moving at the right positions there, taking the light and going through and painting, selecting what color we wanted to use, and then at the end being able to come over onto the side and actually say, hey, let's actually paint some other stuff here because we had this big open spot on the side. This goes to that point of what I was saying for doing things like light painting, where you may have a concept, but then maybe the framing isn't 100% right. You want to do a little bit of extra kind of work to it. This lets you in real time go in and say, hey, I really like the way this looks. You know, this spot is kind of blank, but I know that I'm framed so that maybe I can, you know, come in here and crop this like this if I'm okay with that. But I also want to, you know, fill in the extra space. As I said, it was like a 20-ish minute long exposure. Really, really cool to see how easy this was, and someone who had not ever used this feature before. So I can guarantee if you give yourself like 2 minutes to sit and look at the feature and do some basic playing with it, you'll be able to do some really, really cool shots. When you go later on in the evening here, you get something like this, where it's really, really dark. Obviously, we exposed this so that we want to make sure that we can do under the bridge. We want to light the bridge itself, create this kind of rope effect that kind of fades out into the shadows. And then we've got, in fact, this is Matt, basically just kind of doing a walk through there while I walk behind him and I'm kind of, you know, painting with the pavo tubes. These were the Nanlite pavo tubes, the long ones. Being able to do this in real time meant like, hey, you know, instead of taking hours on end to try to be able to get this done, because maybe, you know, we get halfway through and we realize we didn't really move far enough, or my lights were too bright or something like that. You're able to get the production of something like this immensely faster than you could before. Take a look at some of the other questions that just came in here. Was gonna up. Let's see here. Why did you know questions about more AF updates to the? I will point out here it's because you're not tagging at LUMIX USA. If you don't tag LUMIX USA, I probably won't read your question. Jennifer, is there a way to see how many photos were taken? In what sense do you mean, Jennifer? Do you mean like shutter count on the camera? Or do you mean like how many photos in general you've taken? If it's on the camera, we don't have a way on the camera that tells you shutter count. And I do not recommend doing what some people potentially are doing online to try to get that information. You can royally screw up your camera doing what some people try to do online. Derek says, glad you're back. Two things on the S9. Is there a way to shoot X-Pan 65x24 in video? And any plans to add 1.6 D-squeeze to the anamorphic in the camera? There is not a way to shoot 65x24. What I would recommend for that is most likely just shoot it in like 6K in the open gate, and then in post just crop it 65x24. Because that's all the camera would be doing anyway. I forget what ratio 65 by 24 is closest to for that, but it's doable. You just have to do it in post. And as far as 1.6 anamorphic goes, this is something Matt and I have been working on for a while, wanting to get 1.6 added in, especially because of how fast there is a proliferation of 1.6D squeeze anamorphic lenses. We've talked to Cam Mackey and some of the others about this. So I don't know if it's going to get added or when it would even get added. But it is something that we've been talking a lot about trying to get added in. After all, we are basically the go-to for anamorphic capture since we actually give you tools and none of the other brands do. Wild says, these photos are phenomenal. Question, does E-stabilization work in 4K 120 on the G9 Mark II and GH7? When it's on, it seems to be extremely jittery. I mean, electronic stabilization does work in those cameras. I don't use E-stabilization that often, so... and to be fair, I don't shoot 120 all that often. It's massive overkill for anything I ever do. But I can check with a couple others to see what they're doing. And just kind of get back to you. The biggest thing I always say is just, one, and I know most people probably do this already, but just always make sure that your lenses are up to date in firmware. Make sure your camera's up to date in firmware. Stuff like that, because you want to rule out, is it the lens needing a firmware update to better work with dual IS2 or things like that. So yeah. Let's see here. McCary was gonna upgrade S5 II to S5 IIX, but doesn't look like there's 4K 120. Do the S line cameras have 4K 120? If they have a fan, the G9 Mark II does, but has 4K 120, even HD 300. No, the S5 Mark II, Mark IIX line of cameras cannot do 4K 120. Not that we don't want to be able to do them, it's just the sensors can't do them physically. End of story. That's not a firmware update thing. That's not something that could be done even if we wanted to. That sensor just does not read out at 4K 120. One of the advantages of the sensor that we use in the G9 Mark II, the GH7, is that sensor has ridiculously fast readout speeds, and it has the DR boost functionality. That's what lets us do things like 4K 120. The reality is that sensor that's in the G9 Mark II and the GH7 can do 5.7K at 120. In that case, we just don't have the processing power. So on those cameras, when you look at the 4K 120, that's why it's so much sharper and clearer than what you see from anybody else in that field. Everyone else is either line skipping or binning or a combination of the two, or they have to take a really heavy crop to get to it. The G9 Mark II and the GH7 are actually doing super sampling. They're taking the 5.7K to generate the 4K 120, and that's your ending result with it. Again, the full frame cameras, physically that sensor cannot do it. That's why those cameras don't have it. Automant, can we hope for Bluetooth connection for the DJI Ronin 4 series gimbal on newer cameras like the S5 Mark II? I've asked about it. I don't know what the communication protocol is that DJI uses for it. But everything I've heard is it probably not, but I honestly don't know. I would hope it's something that could be done. DJI is part of the LMAT Alliance, and we have a really good relationship with DJI. I mean, as it sits, we have, when our cameras are connected to them, they do have the direct active track control, which everyone else you have to have the Raven Eyes thing for. So you have a lot of good synergies there between our cameras and the DJI gimbals. That side of it, I'm just not 100% sure of. So. Let's see here. Why not productions? In these days, I get the feeling that most of us are using Resolve to edit. Is it possible to have B-RAW on the GH7? That would be great. We have B-RAW over HDMI. I don't know what the deal is as far as internally being able to record something like B-RAW. You'd have to talk to Blackmagic and people way higher than me in Panasonic. But yeah, I mean, that's just kind of where that is. So, and just to be clear, no other camera outside of Blackmagic has Blackmagic RAW internally. So that should be pretty telling to you as to why no one else has it in their cameras. FC question: what flash power to use to paint live composite light painting? Under 1 stop, under 3 stop? That's where it's going to kind of vary for you. Let me see, this particular shot, I believe the flash was set to something like 1/4 power. Now we're outside, so these flashes are quite far away and they're directed because we're trying to blast that particular spot with light. So you have some of that capability as far as adjusting. Realistically, for a shot like this, you're gonna have to play a little bit. Like for the 2 that I'm showing here, I probably have like 15 others that I'm like, I'm not super happy with that composition or when that flash fired, because I wasn't controlling the flashes. But you start to pretty quickly after that first image be like, okay, I know I want to shift my ISO to this value, because higher your ISO value, the more sensitive you are to be able to capture that flash firing coming in. Same with the aperture value, obviously basics of exposure. So you do kind of think about it. That is a level where if you've been capturing, images like this long enough, you kind of get a pretty good feel for what you should have your lights at. I typically recommend for flash work, start at like 1/4 power. It's usually better to start with. So, is LUMIX going to upgrade the AF of the S5 Mark II more? As mentioned at the beginning of the stream, thank you for tagging. But as mentioned at the beginning of the stream, or maybe you weren't on at that point, we don't comment on future update, firmware, hardware, or any of that kind of stuff. All I will say is look at our track record of upgrading cameras and updating products within their generations. So, any updates on LUMIX Lab? Again, same answer. I meant how many photos during live composite? Oh, okay, cool, Jennifer. Yeah, so if we take a look back at my S5 Mark II that I've got here, if I go in and I start a live composite here, well, that would not be what I want to do. I don't want to do a live composite of 40-second images. So if we come in here, we get the image up. Let's start live composite. Let's bring this to that 1.6. So when I half press the shutter here, you see I did that one black frame, and then I start taking the image. What you'll see here is that right here is the count of how many images I'm capturing. This is the duration of each individual image, and then at the bottom is the overall time for how long it's captured. So you do get the information. It doesn't store it with the actual final image. So that is an area where if you wanted to have that information, you'd want to make sure you're keeping up on the back of the screen. But at the same time, if you know that it's, say, a 10-minute exposure and you're doing a 1/1.6 of a second, or like, say it's a 2-minute exposure and you're doing a 1 second base exposure, it's just the number of times that base exposure fits into the end time. So if you know it's a 20-minute exposure and you have a 1 second individual image, how many times can 1 second go into 20 minutes? There's your answer. Yeah. So that was kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about with live. Oh, the part I missed. So, as mentioned, this is a very video or photo-centric feature, right? You know, we're talking about how to use this with flash and all that kind of stuff for photography. But if you're a video creator, how is this of any relevance to you, right? So if you're filming, say, easiest example I can give is like star trails. You know, you're out, you're working on a project, and you want to add a shot where you have, you know, the star trails building in the sky. Say you're trying to show time passing or something like that. Traditionally, you would have to do this by taking individual photos, getting into that mentality of it, taking all those images, then bring them into software, stitch them basically as a time lapse, and then also go through the process of having those images then stack and automate that stack so you can turn it into a video file, time consuming, very time consuming. With this, in Live Composite, you have the ability that in this particular case, because I'm sitting here and I'm showing you the information so I can show you the button clicks, I can just come in, go into my settings, and I can turn off the HDMI info. And now that HDMI info is off, I can actually start this whole process, have a perfectly clean image that can be getting recorded on an external device, so that while I'm sitting here, I can be painting, I can be looking at the image how I want it, you can watch it grow, and in the end, I have a video clip of that build, of that item being built on the frame. So this lets you actually kind of go in and use this as maybe a little bit more of a creative way to add that extra kind of cool shot that maybe you have in your mind, but may not have the way worked out how to actually make it come to life. We've all seen those images where it's, you know, the star trails and arches, right? Where you have the full circle. Well, to do that traditionally can take a long time because you got to do all the images. And then, as I said, you got to bring them into post. One, you got to edit them the way you want it to look. And then you got to actually go through automating to get the images to line up, to stack. And then you got to actually be able to create a video out of that. In this, it's just done. The file you get out, because you can be recording to an external recorder, gives you that image. If you want it to be ready to go for a, for digital delivery, I can just come in here, and let me turn the HDMI back on. I can just come into the menu and say, because I know I'm going to be, say, capturing this for a video delivery, I just come in, change this to 16:9, and boom, there I go. I'm filling the whole frame. The recorders are going to give you, it's going to come out at 1080, but you get that ability to record and capture this screen and actually use it as a video cut-in. So that can work for things like Flash. That can work for, like the first couple images that I was talking about. You know, if you're trying to show passage of time through, say, a city street, the light trails, things like that, you can do all of these things if you just attach an external recorder to it, and then save out that video file that comes over the HDMI, because you have a clean HDMI that comes out of the camera. So with that, that truly is pretty much the last of what I wanted to kind of cover today. There's a couple last questions came in here. Daily Video says, I think the Dark Generation is right about gyro stable. There's an adaptive cropping, and there is no E-stable jitters. It's an overgeneralization of our electronic stabilization. Also, you have flexibility in post-processing. Yeah, I'm not saying that I disagree with the benefits of gyro stabilization. Gyro stabilization is a really cool thing. Don't get me wrong. I think it's awesome to be able to do it in post. I can tell you that a vast majority of the productions that I work with have zero interest in using it. It's too time consuming right now. Doesn't mean in the future it's not going to get better. A lot of stuff like that comes down more to like the hardware you're using, right? If you want really good, post stabilization and things like that, you need really, really powerful machines, and you got to be able to budget the time. It's a really cool feature, really cool capability. I don't believe that it's something that we're looking at right now, but I wouldn't say never. It's just, as of right now, I don't believe there's things that we're looking at for it. Let's see here. When would I use low cut on the XLR2? What would be a good example? That's a really good question, Jeannie. I don't know. I'm not that great at audio, especially like on the XLR2 adapter, because I just do everything in 32-bit. So I don't use any of that stuff. I just bring it into post, do my adjustments for gain. Maybe I'll go in and use Premiere and use some of their audio adjustments. I can check with Matt Fraser because he knows more about the audio stuff than I do. What I'd say is when this video posts, drop that question in the comments after, and it goes for everybody else too. If you have a question that we didn't get to, or you want to expand on a question, drop it in the comments after the video, because we do read those and we do go through them to see, is this something we can answer on the following week's stream? Is this something that we can just answer right in the chat? that's a really easy way for us to kind of collect and get the information back to you. Yeah. M says, hi, do you think for a long trip in hot, humid places it is better to go with the S9 that has no fan and mechanical shutter, or an S5 II but it's bigger and heavier? It kind of depends. And I know that that's such a cop-out answer. If portability is the most important thing to you, go with an S9. The smaller camera chassis, being able to put like a little small rig grip on it, if you want a little bit more of a grip, I think can be a really, really solid benefit. I love traveling with my S9 because in general, when I put it into my camera bag, I don't have to worry about the EVF hump on the top of the camera. It's flat. So when I put it in my Peak Design bag, it literally just like fits in one of the kind of holder spots that I have it. And then I use the Sigma I series lenses on that camera to keep the kit really, really compact. If the size is not that big of a challenge for you and you're not worried about that particular setup, the S5 Mark II, the S5 Mark IIX, G9 Mark II, those cameras do have, the weather resistance. They have dust splash and freeze resistance. And they are rated to perform better in those environments. Hot, humid places, like I'm in Texas and we're at 93 degrees right now in Austin. When we were in Houston last week, it was like 103 degrees. And while I kind of had to laugh to myself a little bit because of how hot it was outside, that all of our photo scenarios were indoors. So we didn't actually get to show everybody that if you bring our cameras out in like 103, 104 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, they're just going to keep working. You're not going to end up running into problems where the cameras turn off or thermal on you and give you all kinds of problems and frustrations. That can be a massive benefit for an S5 II, S5 IIX. You get the fan, you get the mechanical shutter for if that's something important to you. I can tell you though, yes, a lot of people online talk a lot about how, oh, it's an electronic shutter, you can't use that for photography, that's useless. I call BS on that because I photograph everything whenever I'm traveling, and I use the S9, and I challenge anyone to be able to pick that out for casual street photography. You can't see the difference. So go with the product that works best for you. Go with what fits your particular needs most. Hot, from what you're describing, hot and humid, I would say overtake the long trip and wait side of it. Hot and humid, you probably want more reliability built into your kit, which the S5 Mark II or G9 Mark II series are going to do for you. The long trip, yeah, it's kind of cool, to be able to travel much lighter. But the reality is, sometimes it's the right tool for the right job kind of thing. Okay, with that, I am actually done for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We will be back next Thursday, 2 p.m. Here on YouTube, on LUMIX Live. And yeah, if you have questions that you want us to kind of continue to address next week, make sure to drop those in the comment section below this video after it's posted. And we'll work to get you all those kinds of answers. And if there's something that would make sense to demo on next week's live stream on the 10th, 10th is Thursday, we'll be able to add it into that section here. So with that, thanks everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope you have an awesome weekend. If you liked the video, if you liked the conversation, give us a like, subscribe if you don't already. Follow us over on all the great social platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days. And yeah, we'll see you next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern time, right here, LUMIX Live. Later.